Welcome to the Curator Circle. My name is Tianlong Jiao. I'm the curator of Asian art at the Danforth Art Museum. The Curator Circle is supported by the William Jackson Jr. Endowment. And the goal of this program is to enhance the mutual understanding and appreciation of Asian art by bringing people all over the world to come to Denver to give lectures. And since this program was established in 2001, we have been collaborating, a partner with many organizations and families. So today, we are very grateful to Mr. and Mrs. Robert Kessler for sponsoring our speaker coming all the way to Japan to talk to us. Robert and Lisa are over there. Thank you very much, Robert and Lisa. Tonight's lecture is the first in conjunction with our new exhibit entitled From the Fire, which already opened to the public today. We hope to open tomorrow, but we finished up early, so we open up to the public today already. And just in case you are wondering where we get all those wonderful pieces, they are all from Robert and Lisa's collection. So thank you again, Robert and Lisa, for sharing your wonderful treasures with the public. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight, Mr. Robert Yellin, who came, as I mentioned, all the way to Japan to talk to us. For those of you who read Japan Times, Mr. Yellin probably needs no introduction. He has been reading a popular column called Ceramic Scene for this largest English newspaper in Japan for more than a decade, I guess. Mr. Yellin is a world-renowned scholar and writer on contemporary Japanese ceramics, among many other things. Mr. Yellin is also a member of the Japan Ceramic Society, a very distinguished organization for artists and scholars in Japan. He has worked with so many Japanese ceramists that I think he pretty much knows everybody. And Robert Kessler, and I had the pleasure to travel with him to visit some of the artists in Shigaraki in May. And I was really impressed by his intimate, very close connection with so many distinguished artists in that region, and his profound first-hand experience with the Japanese ceramics. So tonight, it is our honor to have him come to talk to us to kick off this lecture series. Please join me in welcome Mr. Yellin.
Well, thank you very much, Jilong, and what an honor and joy to visit the United States again, and I thank Mr. and Mrs. Kessler for that arrangement. I usually don't get out of Japan very much, but when this exhibition was laid before me, I said, well, let's do it, and it's a great honor and joy to be here. And I'd like to thank Mr. and Mrs. Kessler and Tilong and Douglas and Beverly Little in the AV department. And with that, I'd like to share a little home slide videos with you. As many or some of you know, I do write a column, and I've been in Japan more than half of my life, 24 years in the States and 32 in Japan. So coming back to America is somewhat, I feel like an alien. It's very familiar, but it's also quite distant. And every day of my life in Japan has basically been looking at Japanese ceramic art. And I started out as a collector. There was nothing in English. I talked to the Japan Times, and I said, there's wonderful exhibitions happening in Tokyo. Would you be interested? My first editor, William McKay Smith IV, threw his hands up, said, yes, we've been waiting for somebody to write about this. I used to fax my columns up. Then the internet happened. I got a website called JapanesePottery.com. Thanks to my father, he says, you need a website. I said, Dad, I have a fax machine. People can contact me. He goes, no, the internet's going to be big. And so in the mid-90s, I started this website. And the irony is that my father was a P-51 Mustang fighter pilot who flew missions from Iwo Jima over Japan, and now his son, 60 years later, has Japanese pottery in an old Kyoto house. Quite irony of irony. So this column opened up a world to what's happening now. And I find the gift of life now is so precious. I learned from the past, but I want to introduce what's happening on the ground now. And it was a great honor to travel with Jilong and Robert to visit some of these potters, as we'll see. And I just want to share what's happening now and how it relates to the past and what is on view upstairs, which is quite a magical exhibition. I hope you all get a chance to see it. But when I first went there, it reminded me of a great mentor of mine who I never was able to meet in person. It was the great mythological teacher Joseph Campbell. And he was a scholar of comparative mythology and religion who visited Japan and later reminisced. I will never forget the experience I had when I was in Japan, a place that never heard of the fall and the Garden of Eden. One of the Shinto texts says that the processes of nature cannot be evil. Every natural impulse is not to be corrected, but to be sublimated, to be beautified. There is a glorious interest in the beauty of nature and cooperation with nature, so that in some of those gardens, you don't know where nature begins and art ends. Thus, this was a tremendous experience. And when I recall these words, I also relate them not only to about Japanese gardens, but to ceramics as well. And there's a lovely poem I'd like to read from the 6th century Lao Tzu poet, Chinese poet, that really encapsulates a lot of the spirit in clay and what we see in pots. And it's many of the things we don't see, go to the first slide, that really makes pottery. So in the 6th century BC, he wrote, "Pots are made out of clay, but the hollow space in them makes the essence of a pot, and the essence comes from an intangible something in the spirit of the potter, which he is able to blend into all his knowledge of throwing, the glazing, and the firing, so that every piece from his hand is as much his own signature and his heartbeat. Only then will the pot be good, that is, alive. And the more highly developed a potter is as a human being, the better his pot, for there is no real beauty without character." 6th century BC. I would relate that that probably goes for any person. The more highly developed you are, the more depth and mystery will enter your world. And most of the potters in the exhibition upstairs are such people. So with that, I'd like to just do a little at-home slideshow of sorts. One of my favorite photos is of a circumstance that just happened in the kiln. And many of the pieces upstairs have uncontrollable factors that nobody can really predict. And Mr. Kato from Shigaraki had this piece, and it just fused in the kiln and did this tremendous balancing act. So I always like to bring this as a first photo because it shows some of the uncertain happenstances that happen in a kiln. For those of you who've never been to Japan, here's a map. And most of the classical old styles are in central Japan, usually from the Mino Seto area and going down west. Up here is Tokyo. Many of you know Mashiko. And Mashiko, we'll talk about later, is a relatively new kiln. It's only from the 1850s. And you have to remember, when you're looking at Japanese pottery, you cannot measure it in the times of a Western mentality, particularly from America. Something that's 200, 300 years old is actually still pretty new in Japan when you're talking about 13,000 years ago. Many of the places are named after the styles are named after the places. So Arita, of course, the first porcelain. Hagi, one of the tea wares that was formed by captured Koreans 400 years ago. Bizen, which is well represented upstairs. They're all basically in central and western Japan. And Kyoto is represented by Kyo, because it's called Kyo pottery, and that's where I live right there. Many of the pieces, well, I'd like to start with my first love, and we all remember our first love, which is Bizen. And as I mentioned, many of the potting styles are named after the towns they're made in. And this is a style of pottery that dates back 1,000 years old. It's a small potting village, but they did run the Shinkansen, the bullet train, right through the center of town. But they had to stop construction in the 1960s because they found so many ancient kilns and shards that it held up the construction of the bullet train for a number of years. But Bizen was something that took me a while to get. And when you're looking at this Japanese pottery, throw away Western aesthetics, Renaissance perfectionism, and try to think outside what you're normally thinking of as beauty. Here's some shishi lions on the station wall, made by a famous potter named Urakami Zenji. And here's in front of Bizen, very small little town. These yellow license plates signify a small K car, so a lot of people just get around town like that. And in the back of the station there is the remnants of old 16th century kilns, and they produced pots like this. Now, when you look at something like this and you're bombarding it with questions of, well, that's kind of ugly, and it doesn't really look well proportioned, there are 7 characteristics of Zen arts in Japanese, the world of Japanese arts. And one of them, the first one, is asymmetry or irregularity. It shouldn't be actually perfectly round. You can see a lot of throwing action here. The number 2 is simplicity, something that's basic and has a withered look. Number 3 is lofty dryness, whatever that might mean. Maybe something that's close to divinity. Number 4 is naturalness, something that's effortless. Number 5, and effortless takes a lot of repetition. Number 5 is a subtle, profound grace. Number 6, unconventionality. And number 7, tranquility and stillness. And there's a Japanese aesthetic term called yugen, which is very important in the Zen world. And it says, an awareness of the universe that triggers emotional responses too deep and powerful for words. And when I first found a piece like this, somebody gave me a Bizen mug when I was about 24. I didn't get it because I was talking to myself, it's not pretty, it's got flakes coming off from the glazing. What's going on here? And the moment I turned off my mind and realized that it's trying to bring out the natural essence of material, then my mind became quiet and I really had a relationship and a dialogue with this type of work. And of course, they started out as very simple utilitarian wares. When you look at that map of Japan, Japan is a very mountainous country, and each region has its own style of clay. And that style of clay dictates the characteristics that we see on pots, because in the 12th century, the 13th century, there was no infrastructure. Everything was local. So for Bizen, these were used as jars to store seeds or processed soy to hold flax seeds, etc. Nobody really thought of these as beautiful. It was only until the late 1500s when the piercing eye of the tea master Sen no Rikyu said, that's wabi-sabi. That's in term with my quiet inner tea ceremony. So we're not going to use expensive imported celadons. We're going local. And this is a great jar that I had. It's a 16th century Bizen piece. It's all unglazed. So many of the pieces that you'll see in the Kessler collection are unglazed, which means they're put into the pot, into the kiln, very green. There's nothing applied. It looks like just a gray sphere. And over days of firing, particularly with pine wood, you'll get the pine wood resin to make something called goma, which in Japanese means sesame. So it looks like a sesame flecked pot. There are stones that burst out. I had a PhD candidate from an American college and said, you know, if I took this to my professor as a dissertation project, they would have failed me. But in Japan, this type of accident is actually beautiful. Just like you and I, it's our imperfections which make us perfect. There's nobody else like you, and there's another pot like that. And I didn't get that at first, you know, because I was trying to recognize work with a Western-trained mind. But once I got it, it became a drug addiction of sorts. And the 4th living national treasure, and we'll talk about that in a minute, his name was Fujiwara Yu, and he said, you know, Bizen is really addictive. And I got that after I was able to rinse it. That's a young me, circa 88, where I walked all over Japan. I'm self-trained. I don't think there's anybody who's walked more into these kiln sites and galleries than I have. And this young Iga potter, we kind of look like distant related cousins of sorts. He was like, who is this gaijin foreigner here up in Tokyo, circa 88, interested in my pottery? Because there really was no foreign, of course, collecting back then. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to share with people. It's like telling a friend, you know, that's a really great restaurant down the street. You might be interested. So I knew that this potter was having an exhibition in Tokyo, so that's how I started writing. And I've always loved poetry, and I think of pottery as visual poetry, a haiku of sorts. And in Bizen, like many regional kilns, they lost favor after the Meiji Restoration. When a lot of Japan was looking to the west, many of these regional kilns were actually being forgotten. And at one point in time, Bizen in the early 60s had about 15 kilns. At the height during the bubble, they had about 600. And the revival of many regional styles were largely responsible of a few men. And this is a Bizen bust in the station at Bizen of Kanishige Toyo. And the Kanishige family is one of the most important families in the history of Bizen. The warlord Hideyoshi in the late 1500s visited this area and said, you guys are so good, I'm going to designate you as my honorable craftsman, and there's no war allowed in this area. So no samurai can spill blood here. This Kanishige family is too important. And the family still is potting today. But in the 1920s, the kiln technology of the 1600s was lost, and he revitalized it. One of the most important figures, as such, in 1955, when the Japanese government started to designate people as national living treasures, he was the first one for Bizen. He passed away in 1967. And he took the inspiration of old Bizen, like the jar I showed you, and then they had the sesame and the stone bursts. And this is a lovely little sake cup that I always equate to the Blake poem of seeing heaven in a grain of sand and eternity in your hand. Basically, what that represents, because life itself is water, clay, fire, and air, and nothing else. And that hasn't really changed in pottery since the Jomon period, 13,000 years ago, and the intangible something of the human spirit. So I find it very moving to me that in Japan it's been respected for so long, fire, air, water, and clay, to bring out something so elementally beautiful and functionally nourishing. Some of the people who have reinterpreted old 16th century Bizen is this man. He looks like a mountain hermit poet, wandering poet. He's a very gentle man who was inspired by 16th century pottery and actually walked out into the hills with his teacher in the 60s and 70s and took out old shards, and he's got piles of shards from that period, and they became his teacher. His name is Harada Shuroku, and in the Kessler collection upstairs there are two of his flasks, and they're very bold. They've got a lot of, Peter Volkus was inspired by this, energy, unbounded, born out of the kiln, and he took some stones too. And these were actually implanted in the clay, taken from some clay in Kyoto, where the warlord Hideyoshi had his pleasure dome called Jurakudan, and he put these stone bursts into the clay. But it's a very powerful, you can see how the jar form was transformed into something much more sculptural and energetic. It still has an opening, you could put seeds in there if you wanted to, but of course now it's used for flowers. And that's a tea bowl of his. It's very Gothic, medieval looking, very powerful. And you want to pay special attention to the lip. I mean, tea bowls in Japan have been baffling Westerners since the Portuguese came in the 1400s. Why is a tea bowl so expensive? What's going on in a tea bowl? Why do the Japanese put such a high price on them? It's a spirit. You can't buy spirit. You can't buy the soul. There's no way to put a price on it. And it's one of the greatest challenges of a contemporary Japanese potter to take a very small form and bring it into contemporary life, and he has. Notice the lip, it's very intricately carved. They call that a mountain lip, Yama no Michi, and Mr. Kessler has a very nice sake cup at home with that name, Yama no Michi. And you have to put things into use. The Japanese say yo no bi, or beauty through use. This is just a vessel until you get it into a tea room where it becomes a piece of art. And you have to imagine a very small tea room where it's dimly lit and there's a scroll and maybe some flowers. It's very quiet, very meditative, because it's a journey of internal discovery. And inside this bowl is frothy green tea. So the color, the combination, the setting is all very important when you think of Japanese pottery. It has to be in use. It's not just there to tickle your fancy like a painting on the wall. One of the grand leaders of Bizen today is an outsider. And when you're born into a conservative town like Bizen, it becomes the emperor's new clothes kind of thing. Everybody around you doing the same thing, but that maverick outlaw kind of rides in from the west, learns the tradition, but brings it into really a modern form. And this particular man, who was born 1950, his name is Kakure Zaki. I'm hoping that you might have gotten a printout of the potters' names, but maybe we'll have to deal with that later. Tilong, so, because I know the names will be a little difficult, but you do have this really nice catalog where all the names are in there. And he came from a design background and really shook up the world of Japanese pottery by taking a very old form, an eared form, and giving it attitude. It's almost dancing. It's like hands on its hips, hands on its head, what's going on, but still has the characteristics of what Bizen is. And Bizen, there are different terms to describe Japanese pottery. One is called suchi aji, and aji means flavor, and suchi is clay. So it's really bringing out the inherent beauty of the clay. And the deeper, the richer the firing, the more highly prized a piece is. Now, Kaneshige Toyo, the man in the bust before, he said the most important thing is firing. And the next thing is the beauty of the clay. And the third is form. Now it's been turned upside down. Younger potters, younger artists respect the old forms, but they want to bring it into their own lexicon. So Kakure Zaki was a trailblazer, and I can't express how important he is in Bizen today, giving these helmet forms, something that could never be conceived by a potter, just imitating old 16th century forms, which he did in his early years, but now it's very sculptural and alive and contemporary. This is a work of his. It's very, reptilian of sorts. He gives this one the name Gambaru Man. And Gambaru means like do your best. When you go to a Japanese sporting event, you'll always hear people saying gambatte, gambatte, and it means do your best and don't give back down. So he calls this one do your best dude, basically. But he's very, very important for Bizen. This, when I first saw it, do you think this is beautiful? The cracks, the warps, the grit, it's got this going on it. When I saw this for the first time, it took me a while because I'm thinking, well, it's got chips and it's warped and these deep cracks and what's all this filth on the side, and I just didn't get it until I turned off my mind. This is a very, very, very important 1500s tea water jar called yabure bukuro, which means a broken pouch. And it's an intangible property of Japan. You can't take this away. It's a freshwater jar used in the tea ceremony where you would put some water inside, maybe have a lacquer lid or a clay lid. And during the tea ceremony, when you would need to replenish the kettle, you would put a bamboo ladle in there and draw out some water. And it's one of the most highly prized pieces in all of Japanese history. I think it's in the Goto Museum of Art in Tokyo. But it really turned my head for a spin. And once I got it, I could never look at Wedgwood again or anything like that, which was so pristine and perfect and matched. And the person who is on the poster of the Kessler Collection exhibition is this man. He wasn't smoking anything. Somebody asked, he looked a little tired. He's a very humble, wonderful man. His name is Fujioka Shuhei. He was born around 1947, started to study the style called Iga, which wasn't on the map, I believe, near Shigaraki, and studied with a man who revived it named Tanimoto. His last name is Tanimoto, and brought back the beauty of this. So his interpretation of this are water jars, or here's a water jar of his, And I think you might recognize the style because it is one of the main poster forms for the Kessler collection. In Iga, there are three characteristics called mitsu no keshiki. And one of them is, again, tsuchiaji, the clay flavor, bidoro, which is a Japanese, Portuguese interpretation of glass because it gets this vitrified glass, and koke, which are scorch markings. So they even give names of landscapes like you're looking at a mountainside to describe pottery. And in Iga, again, it's mitsu no keshiki, three landscapes, clay flavor, the fire color, bidoro, the natural ash glaze, and scorch markings where coal and charcoal built up. This is all natural ash glazing. If we went to the potter and said, Mr. Fujioka, I need a set of three, it can't be done. So each one is incredibly unique. And Iga is really hard to fire because they get so many cracks and fissures. This is a wonderful tea bowl. You can see large shell imprints because it was fired upside down. So this actually was facing down like that, and all the ash hit on the back started to vitrify and drip around like that. And when it stops here, it's very lucky, fortuitous, and that's called a tombo no me, or a dragonfly's eye. And I equate this to a clay jewel. A jewel, sapphire, diamond, whatever, is born from the inferno of the planet. And this is a clay jewel born in the inferno of a man-made kiln. And when I look at this lustrous type of glow and sparkle, it looks like an emerald to me. So it really is the same elements where jewels come from. And again, a tea bowl that you would put whipped tea in. And if you've ever been to a tea ceremony, everybody inevitably turns the bowl over. And they're looking at a few things. One is the artistic foot. And in Japanese art, many things are hidden. There's a famous story of Ogata Kenzan, who went to a very ornate picnic in Kyoto in the 1600s. He came with a very drab kimono. Everybody had these ostentatious lacquer boxes and all kinds of floral things, very, very showy. And he had a drab type of kimono. He opened it up. It's gorgeously painted. He takes out his rice ball from a bamboo leaf. Inside the bamboo leaf, it's all wonderfully painted by him, rolls up the bamboo leaf, throws it in the river, eats his rice ball, and goes home. But it's the thing that is unseen, which is very important. And when you turn over a bowl like this, you're looking at the skill of the potter, basically in terms of how they form it. And here's a very bold split foot, which is inspired by the Koreans. And when you look at Japanese art, there's great indebtedness in many ways to the Koreans and the Chinese for technology. And the technology used to fire a piece like this is basically 5th century technology. It's an anagama tunnel kiln that the Koreans introduced to Japan in the 5th century, and he's still using it today. Like, I love my iPhone. I took Steve Jobs looking around Pottery in Tokyo once. I love all this technology. It's great. But what's going to be around in 100 years? What are we living with today that will inspire people in the future? Well, it's a 5th century technology. How can it be improved? It can't. It's as good as it is. I want to live and share things like that somebody can appreciate in time. Another potter, we're skipping now to Shigaraki. And Shigaraki and Iga are